they felt like they needed to.
The difference is that government bonds settle in the money that the central banks print. Yep. Bitcoin doesn't settle in anything. Bitcoin is settlement itself. So the tricky part about them buying reserves is that if they allow banks to do fractional reserve banking and they have a hoard of Bitcoin, then they're just asking for trouble. Basically, that's like a honeypot for financial for hedge funds and the vulture capitalists to come and attack them effectively, because once the banks start over leveraging their Bitcoin reserves, they are in a precarious position where it is possible for me to go and put in a big deposit in that bank and then wait for them to start lending it out and then go and ask for it. Now, they can't give it to me because then illiquid. And so then, if the bank didn't have a lender of last resort, I could put the bank out of business and I could speculate on it by shorting the stock of the bank before making that deposit. And I think this is, I discussed this scenario in the newsletter as well. This is how I see, vigilante hedge funds destroying fractional reserve banking on Bitcoin. It's going to be a massive opportunity for people to make money from it. So now imagine if a central bank is going to want to back that up with Bitcoin, it's going to be an even bigger opportunity to profit off of the collapse of the bank and off of the collapse of the central bank effectively, or at least it's running out of its Bitcoins, because you can just keep milking them at a discount by redeeming the fractionally reserved assets issued by the banks backing up the bank. So effectively, if they want to buy Bitcoin to run to back up a fractional reserve banking system, they're effectively going short on Bitcoin. They have bigger obligations on Bitcoin than they have Bitcoins, and good luck with that one.
Yeah, we agree on that. But they're going to try.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things I found quite scary in doing my research for this, and I think you both talk about it, and it's something I wasn't truly aware of, was the shadow banking system. I think it is within your bulletin, Saif, you highlighted that it was the shadow banking system that caused the 2008 collapse. What is going on here, right? Because it seems to me like this seems to be almost like the Wild West of money printing.
Yeah. It's, historically, I guess, here's how to think about it. Banks were engaged in fractional reserve banking, and that kept, under the gold standard, continued to collapse and make problems. So then they had to abandon the gold standard. And in order to have the central bank as a lender of last resort to allow banks to do fractional reserve banking, the central bank had to institute pretty strict restrictions on banks in terms of how they lend and what they lend and whether they can create credit. And so narrow banking, deposit banking, has been pretty much neutered in terms of its ability to create money. It does create money, of course, but it's well under the control of the central bank. At least in the more advanced economies, it's usually under the control of the central banks. But then what happened after the 1970s and 80s and 90s is the shift towards the investment divisions of banks, or the financial institutions that are not banks, what is called the shadow banks, or not the deposit taking institutions that are guaranteed by the FDIC in the US or their equivalent worldwide. These institutions started engaging effectively in fractional reserve banking, or in maturity transformation, or in rehypothecation. So they were creating money. They were increasing the money supply. And over time, narrow banking, deposit banking just became a boring service that, it doesn't make anybody any money. Banks run it as a small part of their operations. But the real profit is in shuffling around hocus pocus financial obligations in the shadow banking system. And, essentially what it is you just keep working your financial magic over all of that thing, and everybody keeps buying it from everybody else. We keep all pretending that it has value. And then suddenly, if we all market to the value that we all pay for each other, we can meme that value into existence. And that's essentially how this industry has worked for many years. It's effectively, we talk a lot about government inflation, but this is similar to it. In the same way that government can finance its operations, the banking sector can finance itself through the creation of money with in the shadow banking system. But the crazy thing about it is there's no lender of last resort. There's no official central bank behind the shadow financial system telling these people, you can create this much money, and if you fall in a crisis, then we can bail you out of these terms. That's what the FDIC does for the banks, and that's how banks are kept relatively safe and stable, and money creation doesn't go out of hand. But in the shadow banking system, the thing is so enormous and so huge, nobody has any sort of grasp on how big it is, except Caitlin, of course. But pretty much, the money creation is just going on all the time. And, 2008 was the first crisis. And in order to stop it from destroying the dollar and everything, the central bank had to intervene as a lender of last resort with these financial institutions, acting towards them like they would act towards regular banks.
Do you want to add to that, Caitlin?
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, it's and I think when Saif and I first spoke, I was encouraging him as an academic to take on the old Mystery of Banking book from Rothbard, which is an amazing book, but it is a period piece. It's outdated at this point. I think Rothbard wrote it in 1972, something like that. And it described how credit was created and fractional reserve banking worked in the system back then, but it doesn't work that way anymore. And unfortunately, Rothbard's gone. I think if Rothbard were alive today, he would have updated the scholarship to reflect the fact that the credit creation mechanisms have broadened out so much. And the traditional, tracking M0 to see how many times it's multiplied into M2 is really not that relevant anymore, because most of the credit, to Saif's point, is not created in the traditional banking system anymore.
This is a problem that is being created by experts like you, is I cannot keep up with the number of books that I have recommended. I've got two here. I've got My Debt First 5,000 Years. I've got Sovereign Individual. I still haven't finished Bitcoin Standard. I think you need to ease up a little bit on the book recommendations, because it's not going to be good for the trees. Okay, so Saif, look, I read your bulletin, by the way, which is, I just say, it's fucking incredible. I signed up and I was expecting an email, maybe like 20 paragraphs, and I ended up spending half a day reading it and kind of digesting it. And I've been through it twice now. I think everyone should sign up to it. I think it's excellent. One of the things that grabbed me in there was trying to envisage how the revolution happens. And you talk about the benefit of countries such as China, Iran, Russia being able to bypass sanctions and use Bitcoin to trade with each other, but at the same time, that would devalue their own currency. So have I interpreted that correctly?
Well, I sort of, yes, but I guess the bigger point goes back to what I was referring to earlier in terms of central banks and treasuries. I think in my bulletin, I also discussed the idea about whether it would make sense for central banks to buy Bitcoin. And the more I think about it, the more that I lean towards it not being really likely. I think it's not very likely that they would do it. And primarily, it's that central banks are fully staffed with people that don't understand the value proposition of Bitcoin. And secondly, even if they did, they realize that essentially it's a threat to them. And so you can't really expect them to embrace it. And that even the central banks that make a lot of noise about rejecting U.S. hegemony and so on, the U.S., the Chinese or the Russians might talk about how much they hate having to live in a world that is unfair because it's all based on the dollar and the U.S. gets to print the dollar. So they might hate the dollar, but they hate but they like having their own government shitcoin much more than they hate the dollar. And so the problem is that, it's the same way that they've been making a lot of noise about shifting to gold, and they have increased a little bit their reserves to gold, but they won't move towards a system where they clear payments between one another with gold, or where they back their currencies with gold, because if they do something like that, that takes away their ability to create inflation. And if there's anything a government loves, it's inflation, its ability to finance itself with money printing. So they would be cutting off their oxygen supply of being able to print money to finance themselves. And I think that applies to any government. So I don't see it, intellectually and in terms of the mental models that these people have, it's very far from registering. And even if it did register, even if they did think about it, it's extremely against their self-interest. And so this is why, if the subtitle to my book is the Bitcoin standard is the decentralized alternative to central banking. A lot of people have mistaken my book as a call for central banks should buy Bitcoin and use it. And I really don't think that is the case. I discuss it in the book, and I leave the option open. I think it might happen. And of course, it still might happen. But the more that I think about it, the more I lean towards it. Towards Bitcoin being an alternative to central banks rather than a tool that they can use. So instead of using central banks and their currencies for international clearance, now we have another option, which is Bitcoin, which is decentralized, controlled by nobody. And it'll function as a system for international clearance that is separate from an alternative to central banks. And I think the old finance and the central banks and the banks and the shadow banking system that is going to try and come towards Bitcoin, they're going to want to assimilate it. They're going to think that we're going to, bring it into the traditional financial system. I think they're going to burn their fingers by trying to play that game. And I think the future for Bitcoin financial services will likely emerge natively from Bitcoin. It'll likely emerge from people who start from scratch building things around Bitcoin that work on Bitcoin the way that Bitcoin works.
So where does the revolution kind of start? Where's the tipping point? Is this a Trojan horse?
In my mind, it's already over. We've won. It's over. So it's just a matter of you adjusting your own frame of reference for it. So it's all in your head, man. It's about thinking about it. But I mean, okay, I'm kind of joking, but the way that I see it is just that it's going to be different from the way that we view revolution and victory. I think that sort of 20th century terminology needs to go away. It's not going to be an election, and it's not going to be some politician who's going to come into office and implement a Bitcoin-based world. It's going to emerge out of individuals acting. It's going to be something that emerges out of human action and not human design. And so people are just going to start using it more and more. If it continues to succeed, if it continues to not die, and if it continues to maintain its hardness, you would expect that more and more people will use it, more and more systems and financial markets will be built around it. And in fact, I've been recently thinking that I'm going to be including this in my next research bulletin. I'm even not so sure that Bitcoin necessarily needs to